The courthouse archives were not a place for the faint-hearted. They were a graveyard of forgotten cases, where paper held whispers of guilt and ink concealed as much as it revealed. The air was thick with the scent of damp parchment and dust, long settled into the crevices of leather-bound ledgers, but beneath that, beneath the silence, beneath the age-old smell of justice past, was something else. A tension, a presence. Miss Marple knew it the moment she stepped through the heavy wooden doors. She was not alone. The clerk, a wiry man with spectacles perched precariously on the bridge of his nose, barely glanced up from his desk as she approached. She noted the ink stains on his fingertips, the absent-minded way he flipped through a stack of papers, the wariness of a man who had spent far too many years surrounded by forgotten truths. "Records from the Carville trial," she said pleasantly, removing her gloves with practiced ease. "I believe they should still be on file." The clerk sniffed, uninterested, and ran a long finger down the yellowing pages of an index. "Murder cases, yes. Should be in the back." He glanced at her over the rim of his glasses. "Lot of people been looking into that one lately." Miss Marple adjusted the buttons of her coat. "Oh?" Her voice was light, conversational. "How interesting. Journalists mostly," he muttered, pushing back his chair with a groan. "You'd think Carville was some sort of tragic figure, the way they go on about it." She offered a small smile. "I find tragedies are often more complicated than they first appear." The clerk gave her a peculiar look, but said nothing. He disappeared behind a tall set of shelves, leaving her alone with the courthouse's dimly flickering lamps and the distant scratch of pen on paper from the next room. Miss Marple took the opportunity to survey the space. The archives were meant to be orderly, a monument to law and record-keeping, but something felt distinctly disturbed. Files were stacked haphazardly. Some folders were crammed too tightly onto the shelves, others lay loose, their contents spilling like secrets desperate to be heard. A system once precise, now tampered with. The clerk returned, heaving a thick manila file onto the desk with a dull thud. "Carville trial," he said, dusting off his hands. "You'll have to read it here. No taking it out." "Of course," Miss Marple said graciously, settling into the worn wooden chair beneath the hanging lamp. She opened the file, her sharp blue eyes scanning the pages with practiced precision. The first inconsistency leapt out at her immediately. The documents were a mess. Some pages were crisp and official, the ink neat and deliberate, but others, key pieces of testimony, crucial evidence, looked tampered with. A witness statement, signed but redacted, entire sentences blacked out, scrubbed into illegibility. A sheet detailing the discovery of Lyndon's body had a torn corner, just enough to obscure the time of death. Not removed entirely, no, that would have been too obvious. This was deliberate, subtle, meant to plant just enough doubt. She traced a gloved finger over the page, thoughtful. Someone had been careful, but not careful enough. Further in, the pattern became clearer. Certain details had been adjusted, not erased, but twisted, just enough to create uncertainty, just enough to lead someone down the wrong path. Margaret Spencer, the prosecutor, had built her case on these files. She had trusted them, and someone had made sure she was trusting the wrong things. Miss Marple leaned back, hands resting lightly on the pages before her. This wasn't just about Carville. This wasn't just about Spencer's ruined career. Someone had manipulated the trial from the very beginning. They had taken the truth, twisted it just enough, and then sat back to watch the chaos unfold. But they had made one mistake. She tapped a single finger lightly against the desk, a small knowing smile playing at the corners of her lips. Whoever had done this had been in a hurry, and that meant they had left something behind. Her eyes flicked back to the pages. If something had been removed, there would be a gap in the numbering. She flipped quickly through the documents, scanning. 74, 75, 76, 78. Miss Marple exhaled, quiet satisfaction curling at the edge of her breath. She murmured, "Now, where did page 77 go?" The courthouse was silent, and yet not quite. A rustling sound, soft, hurried. Miss Marple did not turn her head, did not react. She merely adjusted her spectacles, flipped another page and listened. There it was again. A faint shift at the far end of the room. Someone moving carefully, too carefully. The courthouse archives were not a place for casual visitors. Whoever was here did not want to be seen. Miss Marple smiled. Her evening had just become far more interesting. Someone else was here. They were here for a reason. She waited then through the gap in the shelving she saw him. A man, at least the outline of one, his hat pulled low obscuring his face. He stood near a set of drawers labeled Trial. Records 192-01925, rifling through papers with quick, precise movements. Miss Marple did not call out instead. She did what she did. Best watched. The figure wasn't just searching. He was looking for something in a hurry, and then just as quickly as she had spotted him, he disappeared. A door creaked open. A shadow slipped through. Gone. Miss Marple let the silence settle before she rose, smoothing her gloves. She moved toward the far end of the room, where the unseen visitor had been standing moments before. The drawers had been left slightly ajar. Trial records, just as she suspected, but it wasn't what was missing that caught her attention, it was what had been left behind. She crouched slightly, her sharp eyes scanning the ground. The floor was coated in a fine layer of dust, undisturbed save for a set of footprints leading toward the exit, and beside them, something else, a small rectangle of card, partially buried under scattered pages. Miss Marple retrieved it carefully, brushing off the dust. It was a library slip stamped with the familiar insignia of St. Mary Mead's lending library. She turned it over. The book it had once belonged to had been checked out 3 weeks ago, shortly before the first of Margaret Spencer's midnight phone calls. The title was faded, but readable: Legal Precedents in Criminal Defense. Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. The person behind this had been confident enough to manipulate the law, but cautious enough to study it first. She straightened, tucking the neatly into her handbag. Someone in St. Mary Mead had been planning something long before Margaret Spencer realized she was a pawn in someone else's game. And Miss Marple was about to find out exactly who that someone was. The courthouse archives were empty, now save for the lingering scent of dust and the quiet hum of something more intangible, the sense that someone had been here just moments behind and had left more than just footprints behind. Miss Marple sat at the heavy wooden desk, the dim overhead lamp casting long shadows over the trial records of Matthew Carvo, the missing pages, the redacted witness statement, the carefully falsified evidence. Each inconsistency had been placed with purpose, designed to mislead. She folded her hands over the library slip she had found, tapping it lightly against the desk. This was not simple forgery. This was something far more intricate. She could see it now. The movements of an invisible hand guiding each event with meticulous precision. First the false witness, a fabrication fed directly to Margaret Spencer, just when she needed it most. Then the midnight phone calls, not threats but whispers, half-truths, meant to erode Margaret's confidence, to make her question her own judgment. The court records tampered with, not razed, not destroyed, but altered just enough to leave a trail of doubt. Miss Marple felt the weight of it, pressing in. This was not about Margaret Spencer. This was not even about Matthew Carville. This was about something larger. Someone had engineered a perfect storm, manipulating the legal system, the press, even the fabric of truth itself, not to convict, but to unravel. Miss Marple took a slow breath, smoothing her gloves over her lap. She had faced many liars in her time. Murderers who had killed for money, for love, for jealousy, for revenge. But this was different. The person she was facing now was not working out of rage or desperation. They were working out of control. Whoever they were, they thrived on deception, on creating chaos and letting the pieces fall exactly where they wanted them to, and Miss Marple had just done something they would not like at all. She had noticed, she had started pulling at the edges of the carefully woven lie, and for the first time in years Miss Marple felt something she did not often feel, a chill. She stood placing the library slip carefully into her handbag. The person behind this was still in the shadows, but not for long. She would find them, and when she did, the game they thought they were playing would come to an end. Outside, the wind howled through the courthouse alley, rattling the window panes, and somewhere in St. Mary Me, a shadow was watching, waiting. The storm had passed by morning, but the air in St. Mary Me was still thick with the damp weight of last night's rain. The roads glistened, the scent of wet earth lingered, and the wind carried the uneasy silence of a village that had grown accustomed to whispering. Inside Miss Marple's cottage, the fire crackled with quiet insistence. She sat at her modest writing desk, neatly copying down the sequence of events she had gathered so far, each name, date, and inconsistency recorded in precise, unheard script. Then, just as she dipped her pen into ink, a knock at the door, not the polite, measured tap of a neighbor. A desperate knock. Miss Marple set her pen down carefully, rose without urgency, and moved to the door. When she opened it, Margaret Spencer stood on the threshold, a woman on the edge. Margaret looked ravaged. Her usual immaculate poise was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out version of herself. Her coat was buttoned unevenly, her hair clung in damp strands to her temples, and her hands trembled violently. Tears streaked her face, though she didn't seem to realize she was crying. Margaret's breath hitched. "I didn't know where else to go." Miss Marple stepped aside without a word, allowing her to stumble into the warmth of the cottage. The room seemed to swallow her whole, the contrast between her trembling frame and the sturdy, comforting walls of the home making her look even smaller. Miss Marple guided her toward the armchair by the fire. Margaret collapsed into it, wringing her hands as if trying to rub away something invisible. "I see him," she whispered. Miss Marple set a cup of tea in front of her, though she doubted Margaret would drink it. "You see whom, dear Margaret?" "Swallowed hard. Rolandern in my dreams, in the mirror last night. In the street outside my house. He's watching me." Miss Marple observed her carefully, hands folded in her lap. "Guilt is a powerful thing." Margaret let out a bitter laugh, pressing her fingers against her temples. "You think I'm going mad, don't you?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I think you are being made to feel as though you are." Margaret shattered. "It's my fault. All of it." The confession. Miss Marple let the silence stretch just long enough. People filled silences in ways that revealed more than they intended. And sure enough, Margaret broke first. "It wasn't my idea," she blurted. "The witness. The fabrication. I knew something was wrong, but I let it happen." Miss Marple didn't blink. "Why?" Margaret squeezed her eyes shut, the weight of something long unspoken settling over her. "Because I had no choice." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, not pushing but waiting. Margaret took a shuddering breath. Someone got to me before the trial. I thought I was just, I don't know, being guided toward the right path." She gave a short, broken laugh. "It started with a letter, then a phone call, then another. They told me what to look for, how to frame the evidence, how to make the case airtight." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "And you trusted them?" Margaret looked at her, haunted and furious all at once. "They knew everything about my father, about the scandal. They said, if I didn't do what they asked, it would all come back. Everything I spent my life running from." Miss Marple let the words settle. This was bigger than Margaret. Whoever had orchestrated this had understood exactly how to manipulate her, not with threats but with the right kind of pressure, the kind that forced a woman like Margaret Spencer to destroy herself. The bigger question. Miss Marple tapped her fingers against the armrest of her chair. "Margaret," she said lightly, "whoever blackmailed you didn't just want you to convict Carville." Margaret exhaled shakily. Then what did they want? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Though there was no warmth in them, they wanted to break you. Margaret flinched. Miss Marple stood adjusting the cuffs of her cardigan, and I should very much like to know why the unseen puppet master, outside the streets of St. Mary Me, stretched out quiet and deceptively peaceful. But Miss Marple knew better. Someone had played Margaret Spencer like a finely tuned instrument, and Miss Marple had just discovered the first real note of their melody. Whoever they were, they had remained in the shadows for long enough. It was time to draw them out. The fire in Miss Marple's cottage crackled low, filling the space with warmth that did little to through the cold dread. Settling in Margaret Spencer's bones, she sat hunched in the armchair, hands clasped in her lap, her breath coming in uneven bursts across from her. Miss Marple remained calm, watching Margaret with that quiet, knowing patience of hers. She had seen people break under guilt, under fear, under the weight of something just beyond their understanding. Margaret was somewhere between all three. I didn't want to bring this, Margaret muttered, fingers fumbling with the inside pocket of her coat. I nearly burned it twice. Miss Marple simply waited. Margaret swallowed hard, then produced a folded sheet of paper, as slightly crumpled at the edges as though it had been handled too many times. She placed it on the small wooden table between them, staring at it like it might come alive. Miss Marple picked it up, unfolded it carefully. The letter was typewritten, the words precise, devoid of character, absent of emotion, except for what lurked beneath them. Miss Spencer, you know what your father did, so do I. It was buried once, but nothing stays buried forever. You have an opportunity to do what is right. The evidence is there. You only need to present it. The witness is real, even if you cannot see him. If you do this, all will remain in the past. If not, well, the past has a way of catching up, doesn't it, a friend? Miss Marple ran a fingertip along the edge of the paper. A friend. She allowed herself the faintest smile. Margaret gave a hollow laugh. Charming, isn't it? Miss Marple did the letter neatly. It's very polite for blackmail. Margaret let out a shaky breath. I didn't know what else to do. They knew everything, things I hadn't spoken of in years. My father, she bit off the words, her jaw tightening. It was as though they'd been waiting for the right moment to use it against me. Miss Marple nodded slowly, weighing the implications. This was more than blackmail. This was orchestration. Someone had waited, prepared. The manipulation had been laid out so precisely, guiding Margaret step by step, making sure she saw only what they wanted her to see, believed only what they needed her to believe. And then, when the trap had fully closed, they vanished, leaving only ruin behind. Miss Marple tapped the letter lightly against her palm. Did you ever respond? Margaret shook her head. How could I? There was no return address, no way to track them. It was as if they knew I wouldn't refuse. Miss Marple's lips pressed together. Of course they had known whoever had done this wasn't working on chance. They were working on certainty. The meaning of the letter. Miss Marple considered the facts. The typewritten letter, free of any real identity. Machine had written it, not a person. The timing right before Margaret presented the evidence, right before she convinced herself that the fabricated witness was real. The sign of a friend, not a name, not a title, a shadow signing its work. She had seen this before, not this exact crime, not this exact cruelty, but this kind of mind, someone who saw people as pieces on a board, someone who understood fear better than most, someone who did not just want power, they wanted control. Miss Marple tucked the letter into her handbag with a deliberate motion. This was never about your father, she said gently. This was never even about you. Margaret blinked. Then what was it about? Miss Marple adjusted her gloves, looking toward the darkened window. It was about making sure the right person fell at the right time. Margaret's breath hitched. Miss Marple rose to her feet. And I believe I am quite ready to find out who set the board in motion. The cottage settled into silence, the fire flickering in the hearth, outside the village of St. Mary Me, remained still, but Miss Marple had the distinct feeling that somewhere someone was watching and waiting. The fire in Miss Mar's cottage burned low, casting flickering shadows against the walls. Margaret Spencer sat hunched in the armchair, her hands clenched in her lap, her usually sharp features drawn and hollowed out by exhaustion. Miss Marple, seated opposite her, remained composed, her expression neutral in that infuriatingly calm grandmotherly way that often unsettled people more than outright confrontation. She had seen many people unravel under guilt, fear or deception. She had yet to decide which category. Margaret Spencer belonged to. Margaret wiped a trembling hand across her forehead. "You think I should go to Cork?" Miss Marple reached for the teapot, pouring herself another cup with a steady hand. "I think," she said lightly, "that the good inspector would prefer to hear this now, rather than later, and I rather think it would be better for you if he did." Margaret gave a hollow laugh. "Better for me? You think Crike will take one look at me, and think I'm innocent?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead she lifted the teacup to her lips, taking a delicate sip before setting it down. "I think," she said, eyes sharp behind her spectacles, "that whether you are innocent or guilty is not the most pressing concern." The moment Margaret flinched a fraction of a second, a hesitation, Miss Marple saw it. She had been watching people lie to themselves for a very long time. Margaret exhaled, fingers tightening around the edge of her coat. "I called. If I go to Crike, they'll say I tampered with evidence that I wanted to believe in, that witness that I lied to the court. The papers will crucify me. I'll never work again." Miss Marple tilted her head. "But you have already lost everything, dear." Margaret pressed her lips together hard. The crack in her composure deepened. Miss Marple softened her voice. "Margaret, fear makes us hold on to things that are already gone. Your reputation is not what's at stake anymore. Your life is." Margaret swallowed. She wanted to believe that Miss Marple had all the answers, but something inside her, some lingering instinct of self-preservation, kept her from leaping into that abyss. Miss Marple watched her carefully. It was the first real moment of clarity she had seen in Margaret since she had arrived. Not fear, not guilt, just calculation. The subtle doubt. Miss Marple leaned back, observing her with a kind but measured look. Margaret was a brilliant woman, a woman who had built her career on knowing when a witness was hiding something, when a defense was fabricated, and yet she had fallen into this trap so neatly. Or had she? Miss Marple, her hands neatly in her lap. "You say you were manipulated, that you were forced into presenting false evidence, that someone used your past against you." Margaret nodded, exhaling shakily. "Yes." Miss Marple studied her. "And yet I cannot help but wonder." Margaret, "What else? Aren't you telling me?" Margaret's head snapped up. What? Miss Mark's expression did not change. "There is something else. Isn't there something you haven't said? Something you have carefully chosen not to say?" Margaret swallowed, but didn't answer. It was a pause, a slight change in her breathing, the flicker of something not quite honest. Miss Marple let the silence sit between them, just long enough to make Margaret uncomfortable. Finally she sighed, reaching for her teacup once more. "You don't have to tell me now, dear," she said lightly, "but sooner or later someone will ask the right question." Margaret clenched, her jaw staring into the fire. Miss Marple knew that look. She had seen it before in men on the witness stand, in women whispering secrets they never meant to be heard. Margaret Spencer was hiding something important, and Miss Marple intended to find out what. By mid-afternoon St. Mary Me had come a cauldron of whispers and unease. The air was thick with it, rumours curling around hedge RS, slipping through the pews of the parish, and settling like dust in the corners of the local shops outside the Rose and Crown. A note of villagers stood hunched beneath their hats, their voices hushed, but insistent. "She's playing the victim," muttered Mrs. Aldridge, arms folded tight across her chest. "Mark my words, Margaret Spencer's was only sorry she got caught. Caught doing what Mabel Dunn scoffed, adjusting her hat pin. If she's guilty, then why is someone sending her threatening letters?" Aldridge sniffed. "Who's to say she didn't write them herself? A woman in her position, desperate. What better way to make us all feel sorry for her?" Further down the lane, Thomas Beale, the shopkeeper, stood at his doorway, shaking his head as he listened to two men argue. "I say, get Carvel behind it all," one of them spat. "Man, gets tossed in jail, stews for 6 months, comes out a hero. Now suddenly Spencer's evidence vanishes, and she's the one on trial. Convenient, isn't it? He's not smart enough to pull off something like that." The other counted. "Then, who is?" No one had an answer. Miss Marple, passing by, observed the scene with her usual air of detached amusement. Villagers she amused were a funny sort of jewelry, rarely fair, easily swayed, and always ready to pass sentence before the trial had begun. As she neared the parish, she stopped short, pinned to the parish notice board, between advertisements for fresh eggs and an upcoming church fete, was a letter. The paper was creased, the ink hastily scrolled, "Murderers do not deserve mercy." Miss Marple tilted her head, her lips pursing slightly. She plucked the knot from the board, folded it neatly, and slipped it into her handbag. The village, she thought, was beginning to boil, and when things boiled, something always bubbled to the surface. Late night. Chase. It was nearly midnight when Miss Marple and Inspector Crack reached the abandoned cottage at the edge of town. The structure sagged against the wind, its roof half caved in, its windows gaping like empty eyes. The trees bent low around it, casting deep shadows in the moonlight. Crack exhaled through his nose. "I don't like this." Miss Marple adjusted her gloves. "That makes 2 of us. Inspector, they had been led here by a single piece of information. A whispered rumor that this was where the secret witness had once met his handler. If true, it meant the puppeteer behind Margaret's downfall had left traces in the very walls of this place." The wind howled somewhere in the distance. An owl screeched, then a flicker of movement. A figure cloaked and shadowed slipped through the doorway of the cottage. Crack tensed there. Miss Marple didn't hesitate. She moved toward the entrance, her steps deliberate but silent, the inspector close behind. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp wood and rotting leaves. The remains of an old fireplace yawned in the darkness, and dust clung to every surface. Then suddenly the figure moved, a blur of fabric, the scrape of a boot against the floor, and then they ran. Crack cursed under his breath. "Damn it!" Miss Marple, surprisingly light on her feet, followed as quickly as she could. The figure slipped through the back of the cottage, tearing through the trees, the sound of snapping branches marking their path. The inspector gave chase, his heavy footsteps pounding against the earth. By the time they reached the clearing beyond, the figure was gone, but not everything had disappeared. Near the base of an old yew tree, something fluttered in the wind. Crack bent down, plucking it from the damp grass. Slip of paper, the writing was faint. Hurried. Wednesday midnight. Cemetery. Miss Marple exhaled lightly. The puppet master was preparing for the final act. A pervasive sense of fear back at Spencer Cottage. Margaret gripped the armrests of her chair, her breathing ragged. "A midnight meeting," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, no, you mustn't go." Miss Marple poured tea, as if they were discussing something as ordinary as a dinner invitation. "I must," she said simply. Margaret's hands bowled into fists. "You don't understand. This isn't just about me anymore. Whoever they are, they won't stop. They'll destroy anyone who gets in their way." Miss Marple set down the teapot. "Then I'd rather not be waiting in the dark when they do." Margaret's breath hitched. Crack, standing by the fireplace, frowned. "I don't like it either, but she's right. Whoever's behind this has been leading us somewhere." He turned to Miss Marple. "I'll be there with you." Miss Marple smiled faintly. I should hope so, Inspector. While I do believe in handling matters delicately, I do not believe in wandering through cemeteries at midnight. Alone, Margaret buried her face in her hands. Miss Marple watched her, a small thread of doubt curling at the edges of her thoughts. Was this fear, or was this something else entirely? She turned back to Craig. Well then, it seems we have an appointment to keep. The wind rattled. The window panes outside the village slept, but somewhere in the darkness, someone was waiting. The cemetery was the sort of place that kept its secrets well. Fog curled around the headstones, pooling low to the ground, like something alive. The moon sat heavy in the sky, casting long silver streaks between the twisting branches of the old yew trees. Miss Marple walked with measured steps, her heart beat steady but louder than usual in her ears. Inspector Crack trailed behind at a respectable distance, close enough to intervene, far enough to remain unseen. The night was still, save for the occasional rustle of wind through the grass, and yet she was not alone. Somewhere in the shadows, someone was waiting. Her gloved fingers tightened around the handle of her handbag. There were two possibilities. The figure she was about to meet was the mastermind, the one dark who had orchestrated this entire elaborate web of deception, or she was about to meet another pawn set up to divert suspicion at the last moment. Miss Marple was inclined toward the first. She reached the appointed place, a gnarled oak tree, its twisted roots pushing up through the damp earth. A morsel stood just beyond it, its iron gate slightly ajar, the blackened stone gleaming faintly in the moonlight. Then a shift in the fog. A figure stepped forward, silent as a spectre. They wore a dark coat collar turned up, and a wool scarf pulled high over their mouth. A hat cast a shadow over their eyes, but Miss Marple could still make out the tension in their posture, the way their gloved hands curled slightly, as if bracing for something unseen. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then the figure's voice came low and deliberate. "You shouldn't have come alone." The reveal. Miss Marple smiled slightly, though she did not move. "Oh, but I never alone." A flicker of hesitation, a glance over the shoulder. Yes, they were nervous. "Do you know," Miss Marple continued, adjusting the clasp of her handbag, "it took me quite a while to understand your endgame. It was a very impressive one. I must admit, the kind of plot that requires patience, foresight, a mind that enjoys watching the board shift before making its move." The figure exhales a slow and measured breath. "You should leave this alone, Miss Marple." "But then I wouldn't be here," she said pleasantly. "Then you would be free to complete whatever final act you had in store. But unfortunately, dear, you made one small miscalculation." She took a step forward, her eyes gleaming with quiet amusement. "You assumed I was like everyone else, that I would see what you wanted me to see." The figure tensed. Miss Marple tilted her head, studying them. "But I've been watching you, and it occurred to me, every witness, every falsified statement, every piece of evidence carefully planted to unravel Margaret Spencer, it was all done with just enough precision to look convincing, but not enough to hold under scrutiny." The figure fingers twitched slightly. Miss Marple smiled. "Because that was the point, wasn't it?" The figure didn't answer. Miss Marple's voice softened, but there was steel beneath it. "You never wanted Margaret convicted. You wanted her humiliated. You wanted her credibility destroyed, so that no one would ever believe a word she said again." The silence stretched, then a chuckle, low and bitter. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for." The figure murmured. Miss Marple sighed. "You would not be the first to make that mistake." A shift in the fog, a glint of something silver, a small knife flashing in the moonlight. Before the figure could move, a sharp voice cut through the night. "That's quite enough," said Inspector Craig, stepping from the shadows, his pistol drawn. The figure stiffened. Then with a quick calculated movement, they dropped the knife and stepped back, hands raised slightly. "You took your time," Miss Marple murmured to Craig. He huffed. "I thought you were enjoying yourself." The figure, a face now half revealed beneath the hat and scarf, let out a sharp breath. You have no proof, Miss Marple smiled. Oh, but I do, she said, and I dare say you already know what it is. The figure's eyes darkened. Miss Marple dusted off her gloves. It was over, and they knew it. The air in the St. Mary Me cemetery was thick with mist curling around the tombstones in restless tendrils. The night had settled into a silence too deep to be natural, as if the ground itself was waiting for what came next. Miss Marple stood tall, her hands calmly folded over the handle of her handbag, but her sharp blue eyes remained fixed on the shadowed figure before her, the manipulator, the unseen hand behind Margaret Spencer's fall, the whisper in the dark. The architect of this entire deception tilted their head slightly. The scarf covered most of their face, but their voice when it came was unmistakably amused. You're middling, Miss Marple, they murmured, though I suppose I should be flattered. It's not every day I warrant such attention. Miss Marple sighed, adjusting her grip on her bag. I do find that flattery when used in moments like these is rather like sugar in a bit of tea. A poor attempt to ask something, far more unpleasant a chuckle. Oh, but I do appreciate you. You're so terribly persistent. The figure took a step closer, voice dipping lower, almost conspiratorial. But you see, Miss Marple, you've already lost. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. Have I? The figure sighed, shaking their head. Margaret was so easy to break. I had hoped for more resistance, but well, family shame does that to a person. There's nothing quite as corrosive as disgrace. Wouldn't you agree? Miss Marple's voice was calm, but clipped. So that's what this was, an exercise in vengeance. You've unraveled a woman's entire life, because of a grudge, against her father. The figure let out a mocking laugh. Oh no, dear lady, this wasn't vengeance. They leaned in slightly, their voice dropping into a smooth dark whisper. This was justice, the past unburied. Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but her mind was already working through the puzzle. Margaret's father, Francis Spencer, a scandal long buried, a disgrace that had clung to Margaret, despite her desperate attempts to escape it, and now here was the missing piece. The reason behind this meticulously engineered collapse. She spoke softly, letting the words settle like a blade sliding into place. You're the one he betrayed, aren't you? The figure stilled. Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle but unwavering. You were part of it. The banking scandal. You weren't some distant victim. You were too close. Someone who lost something far more valuable than money. The figure let out a slow exhale, as if amused by the realization. You really are a clever old thing, they murmured. Miss Marple ignored the insult. He adjusted her gloves. This was never about Margaret Spencer, she said. This was about Francis Spencer, about making his daughter suffer for his sins. The figure let out a slow, deliberate chuckle. Do you know what I hate most about you, Miss Marple? They mused. It's that you never get things entirely wrong. Miss Marple offered a thin, pleasant smile. It does seem to be a great inconvenience for people like you. The cemetery was silent, the kind of silence that wrapped around the bones of the dead, swallowing sound, stretching moments into eternity. Gravestones stood like forgotten sentinels, their edges softened by fog that curled low over the ground, shifting like something alive. The air was damp with the scent of earth and old rain, heavy with the weight of things unsaid, things unseen, and yet something moved. A figure stepped from the shadows, slow, deliberate. Their coat barely whispered against the cold air as they tilted their head, considering Miss Marple for a long moment. Then almost lazily, they lifted their hand, and something caught the moonlight. A knife, not large, not flashy, but precisely the kind of blade used when silence was required. Miss Marple did not flinch. She had faced death before, though rarely with a weapon pointed so directly in her direction. Behind her she knew Inspector Crack was waiting. She could feel his presence in the dark, a hunter poised just beyond the veil of mist. The figure took a step forward, their grip tightening on the knife, the blade gleaming, small, practical. made for efficiency. Then just as they shifted their weight, ready to strike, a sound cut through the night. Click. The unmistakable, unyielding click of a revolver being cocked. From the shadows, Inspector Crack's voice was calm, steady. Would be a very bad idea. The figure froze. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Shall we continue this conversation without theatrics? She suggested, her voice as mild as if they were discussing the weather over tea. The cemetery seemed to hold its breath. The fog swirled between them, shifting like something waiting, watching. The knife did not lower. The figure's voice, when it came, was low, controlled, but there was an edge now, a touch of desperation. You should have left it alone. Miss Marple tilted her head, as if considering the thought. Then she smiled. Yes, she mused. That does seem to be the general sentiment of people who prefer their crimes to go unnoticed. The figure took another step forward, and then, that's close enough. Crack's voice rang out, sharp and firm. The figure whipped around, startled, caught between fight and flight. Crack did not waver. His revolver gleamed in the moonlight, his stance unwavering. Drop it. Nobody moved. For a moment the night seemed frozen in place. Then a shift. The knife wavered, shoulders tensed. Miss Marple, a lifetime of observation telling her exactly what would happen next, took a single step back, just as the figure bolted. A sharp twist of movement, a blur of dark fabric. Gone. Damn it, Crack swore under his breath. The figure ran full tilt into the fog, disappearing into the twisting grave markers. The mist swallowed them whole. Crack lunged forward. Stop. But they were fast. Too fast. He took off after them, crashing through the undergrowth. Footsteps pounded into the earth. Then nothing. Gone. Miss Marple, however, did not follow. She didn't need to. Her eyes had already landed on what the figure had left behind. Near the base of the old oak tree, something fluttered in the wind. A scrap of dark fabric, torn from a sleeve, heavy material, expensive. A gentleman's coat, not something a common criminal would wear, but it was the second thing that caught her attention. An envelope, dropped carelessly in the rush to escape. Miss Marple bent down, retrieving it with careful fingers. The paper was crisp, the seal was broken. Inside a single folded page. She opened it. The words were sharp, deliberate. Our agreement remains. Wednesday was only the beginning. I expect results, or everything falls apart. Miss Marple exhaled softly, a faint smile playing at the corners of her lips. So the puppet master was not acting alone. Someone else was pulling the strings. Crack returned, breathless, his coat dusted with fog. His jaw was tight with frustration. Lost them, he muttered, shoving his gun back into its holster. Vanished into the trees. Miss Marple straightened, brushing off her gloves. Oh, don't worry, Inspector. She handed him the note. They won't stay hidden for long. A reckoning at dawn. The morning mist clung to St. Mary Mead, swirling low over the fields and creeping through the village like the remnants of an unsettled dream. The air carried a peculiar charge, the kind that comes before a storm or before a reckoning. Inside Miss Marple's cottage, the sitting-room table had become a battlefield of paper, the torn fabric from the cemetery, the anonymous letter, the altered records from the courthouse, each piece laid out not in chaos, but in order, waiting to be understood. Inspector Crack stood by the fireplace, arms crossed, brow furrowed. He had read the note twice. Now he turned it over in his hands, fingers tracing the crisp edge as if the paper itself might give up its secrets. Our agreement remains. Wednesday was only the beginning. I expect results, or everything falls apart. He exhaled sharply. Who the hell is I'd? Miss Marple, seated in her usual chair, adjusted her gloves with quiet precision. That, dear Inspector, she said, her voice light but laced with something undeniable, is precisely what we are about to find out. About to find out the final clue, she gestured toward the courthouse. Files, particularly the pages, half-torn, redacted, manipulated the inconsistencies in these records. The deliberate gaps suggest someone altered them in haste, but not without purpose. She tapped the missing page number, and when we cross-record the time of the reduction with the legal precedent book, checked out from the Samari Me Lending Library, we arrive at one single address. She slid a slip of paper toward Crack. He read it, his jaw tightening. The vicarage. Miss Marple nodded. Crack frowned. The Reverend. No, Miss Marple said lightly, but someone with access to his study, someone who could work unnoticed, someone who, like our manipulator, thrives in the shadows. Crack exhaled. You're calling everyone together, aren't you? Miss Marple's lips twitched into a faint smile. Oh yes, Inspector. It's time for a conversation by late afternoon. The vicarage drawing room had become a stage, and Miss Marple, its quiet director, the key players arrived, each one stepping into the room, like suspects, summoned, before a judge. Margaret Spencer, pale, her hands twisting in the lap. She looked exhausted, as though sleep had become a thing. Matthew Carrill, sharp-eyed and wary, his stance defensive. Reverend Johnstone, bewildered but accommodating, standing by the bookshelves with an air of polite discomfort. Mrs. Aldridge and Thomas Beale, two village voices, who always knew more than they let on. Inspector Crack loomed near the door, arms folded. His presence made it clear this was not just a friendly chat. Miss Marple took her time arranging her notes before speaking. I find, she began, her voice mild, that when a crime is carefully orchestrated, the true villain is rarely at the center of the chaos, but rather just outside of it. The room tensed. She turned to Margaret. You were the perfect mark, my dear. Brilliant, respected and vulnerable. You had spent your career proving yourself, overcoming your father's disgrace. That is precisely why our culprit chose you. Margaret swallowed. But why? Miss Marple smoothed the edge of her glove. Because they didn't want Carol convicted. They wanted you destroyed. Margaret flinched. Crack's gaze swept the room. Who? Miss Marple picked up the torn fabric from the cemetery, holding it between her fingers. This belongs to a tailored coat. One belonging to a gentleman of means, someone who moves through the village without suspicion. Someone who, I dare say, could sit in a vicar, study forging documents, making small manipulations where needed. She let the words sink in before turning her gaze to Thomas Beale. The room shifted. Beale blinked, then laughed, a small incredulous sound. Miss Marple, surely you're not suggesting? But I am, she said pleasantly. Silence then, a change not in words, but in posture. Beale's shoulders squared slightly, his breath slowing, and Miss Marple knew the performance was over. She continued, her tone calm but precise. You were once a banker, weren't you, Mr. Beale? Before you became the village shopkeeper, a banker with connections, one who might have been burned by Francis Spencer's scandal. Beale's fingers twitched. That was decades ago. Yes, Miss Marple said, and yet it was enough to make you wait. Margaret stiffened. Wait for what? Miss Marple turned to her. For the right moment. To take back everything your father cost him. A slow, chilling exhale. Bio's face remained impassive, but his eyes had changed. Revenge is patient, Miss Marple continued. You didn't care about Carville. You barely cared about Roger Linden's murder. You only cared about dismantling Margaret Spencer's career. Piece by piece, she lifted the note from the cemetery, reading aloud. Our agreement remains. Wednesday was only the beginning. I expect results or everything falls apart. She folded the paper and met Beale's gaze. You weren't working alone, were you? The smallest flicker of something crossed his face. Annoyance, amusement, and then he smiled. A small cold smile. You really are quite something. Miss Marple. Craik straightened. You admit it then? He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. Admit what exactly? That Margaret Spencer dug her own grave. The moment she chose ambition over honesty, that justice one way or another always finds its mark. Miss Marple's voice was quiet. Justice not the same as vengeance. Mr. Beale, his expression flickered and for the first time he looked tired. Crack took a step forward. We can place you at the courthouse altering the records. The letter connects you to an accomplice. We find them too. Beale looked between them, assessing, calculating, then he simply sighed. You've got your confession, Inspector, he muttered. Margaret let out a shaky breath, her hands still trembling. Miss Marple studied Beale for a long moment, and in his eyes she saw what she had suspected. All along this had never been about Carol. It had never been about justice. It had only ever been about making sure Margaret Spencer fell as hard as her father once had. Miss Marple stood smoothing her skirt. The trouble with revenge, Mr. Beale, she said lightly, is that it always leaves one loose thread, and I do so enjoy pulling at those. Craik stepped forward, producing the handcuffs. Beale didn't resist. Margaret's breath hitched as she watched him being led away. Miss Marple turned to her, her expression softer now. It's over, my dear, she said gently. Margaret nodded, but her eyes, so full of exhaustion, of relief, of something else entirely, remained fixed on the door where Beale had disappeared. Because revenge might have ended, but the ruin left in its wake would take far longer to fade. The vicarage drawing room was thick with the old books, and something far less tangible, tension, tightly coiled, waiting to snap. The storm outside had passed, but inside, something far more dangerous was about to break. Miss Marple sat serenely at the head of the room, her hands resting lightly on the edge of her handbag. The others were gathered around her like an impromptu jury. Inspector Crack, Margaret Spencer, Matthew Carville, Reverend Johnstone, and the villagers who had been whispering in dark corners for weeks. And then the youth Thomas Beale. The shopkeeper sat stiff as bedded, outwardly composed, but Miss Marple saw the tiny betrayals of his body. A twitch in the fingers, a breath held just a fraction too long, the calculated effort not to react too soon. He was waiting, watching, calculating. Miss Marple had seen many men like him before. They never thought they could lose until they did. The pieces on the table. She took her time arranging her notes, tapping a single typed letter lightly against the table. Justice, she said pleasantly, is a word I find so often misused. Some think it means retribution, others believe it means fairness, but I find in cases such as this it often means something much simpler. She lifted her gaze to Beale. It means the truth. Catching up with you. Beale didn't blink. Are you accusing me of something, Miss Marple? Oh yes, she said, almost cheerfully, but let him not be impatient. I should hate to rush to conclusions. Crack crossed his arms. Just get on with it. Miss Marple smiled, then gestured toward the stack of evidence before her. Let's begin with the forged court records. The documents that led Margaret Spencer to believe in a witness who never existed. We now know that the alterations were made in precisely timed intervals just before each major hearing in Carville's case. That suggests inside knowledge, someone who knew exactly when and how to act. She tapped the library, slipped the edges still dusted with the courthouse's archive. Grime, a witness has come forward, she said smoothly. Someone who saw a man slipping into the courthouse archives on more than one occasion. And interestingly, that same man was seen checking out legal texts from the St. Mary Mead lending library books that detailed how to falsify evidence without detection. The room shifted. Beale tilted his head slightly. And what does that prove? Oh, nothing at all, Miss Marple said, eyes twinkling. Unless, of course, one compares the footprints found in the courthouse's restricted archives to those that so kindly led us through the cemetery the other night. Beale's jaw tensed. Margaret let out a shaky breath. Realization dawning. Craik took a step forward. We found the torn fabric from your coat, Beale. You must have noticed tailored wool leaves quite a distinctive tier when caught on an iron gate. Beale's hands curled into fists. This is nonsense, Miss Marple's almost pitying. And then of course we have the letters, the ones Margaret received, and the one we found at the cemetery. She held up the two notes, identical typeface, identical phrasing. I imagine if we compared these to your typewriter, Mr. Beale, we would find a perfect match. The air went still. Beale exhaled sharply. Then he smiled. Not in fear, not in anger, in admiration. You really are quite something. Miss Marple, she inclined her head. Yes, I am rather the final bluff. But Beale was not the type to fold easily. He leaned back in his chair, smoothing the cuffs of his coat, regaining his composure. Let's say I did write those letters. Let's say I even tampered with some files. That still doesn't mean I killed Roger Linden. Miss Marple nodded. Quite right. You didn't. Margaret stiffened then. Huh. Who did, Miss Marple? Let the room sit in silence for just long enough. Then she looked back at Beale, her voice turning deceptively mild. The truth is, Mr. Beale, you are not the mastermind. Beale's expression froze. It was the smallest shift. But Miss Marple saw it, a flicker of something, uncertainty, a miscalculation. She pressed forward. You were clever. You moved pieces precisely. You spent years waiting for the right moment. But you weren't alone, were you? Beale said nothing. Miss Marple smiled gently. The note we found at the cemetery. It wasn't for you, was it? It was from someone giving you orders. Beale's jaw tightened. You made one mistake, Mr. Beale, she continued. You assumed you were playing everyone when in fact you were being played too. Silence then. A slow measured breath from across the room. Miss Marple turned. Reverend J. Stone stood by the bookcase, his face ashen, his hands gripping the shelf behind him. Margaret let out a soft gasp. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap. You were the only one, Reverend, who had access to every person in this case. You knew Margaret's weaknesses, Beale's bitterness and Carville's innocence. You set the board and you let the pieces fall. J.M. Stone swallowed. That's absurd. Miss Mark's voice was kind, but firm. Is it? She lifted the cemetery letter again. The phrasing. Our agreement remains not an order, a confirmation. Beale was your tool, but you were the one who called the shots. John Stone's breath itched. Cruff moved toward him, slow and deliberate. You've played God for quite some time, Reverend, he muttered. But the game's over. A long silence. Then John Stone exhaled and smiled, a cold, satisfied smile. Well, he said softly, I suppose you win, Miss Marple. Miss Marple tilted her head. Oh no, dear. Justice wins. And as Craik reached for the cuffs, the storm outside finally broke. The vicarage drawing room was thick with the weight of truth. It clung to the air, filled the corners and settled onto every face in the room. Like dust in an abandoned house, the storm outside had broken, rain pattering lightly against the windows, but inside the real tempest had just passed. The manipulator, Reverend Johnstone, a man of faith, of supposed virtue, stood in the center of it all. His mask slipping, Prue's revolver gleamed faintly at his hip. But John Stone was no longer a threat. The real weapon had been his mind, his patience, his ability to pull strings from the shadows. And now that his game was up, his hands hung loosely at his sides, his shoulders slumped across from him. Margaret Spencer sat very still. She had won in a sense. She was not the villain, not the fraud they had painted her as in the papers. And yet her face was pale, her hands motionless in her lap. She had been used. Yes, but she had also allowed it to happen. Miss Marple watched her carefully. She had seen this moment before, that painful, inevitable recognition of one's own mistakes. Margaret swallowed hard. I should have known, she murmured. The letters. the phone calls, the way it all unraveled. So conveniently. She let out a bitter, breathless laugh. I was so desperate to be right that I never even considered I could be wrong. Johnston chuckled, dry shaking his head. Though Marga, he said, voice laced with condescension, you were desperate to win. And you did what everyone does when they want to win. You took the PA, laid out for you, and never stopped to question who built it. She flinched, but she didn't look away. Miss Marple spoke, then her voice calm, but cutting. And you, Reverend, took great care to ensure she never would, didn't you? Johnstone exhaled sharply, anger flickering beneath his controlled exterior. I was doing what should have been done years ago, he said, voice low and dangerous. Francis Spencer ruined lie, mine included, and no one ever answered for it. Margaret had everything, a career, respect, the ability to walk through this village without shame, and you all act as if she's a victim. His voice rose raw, and laughter, seething, is a legacy of a fraud, and I made sure she suffered for it. Margaret's mouth parted slightly, shock blooming across her features. Miss Marple did not react. She had known men like Johnstone before, men who justified their cruelty as if it were a form of justice. Johnstone was unraveling now, as all manipulators did. When the walls closed in you, he said, turning on Miss Marple, eyes burning, you and your questions, your watchful little eyes. You couldn't leave it alone. Miss Marple adjusted her gloves. No, dear, she said pleasantly. I very rarely do, he laughed. Then a short, bitter sound. You think you're clever? He sneered. But what did you really accomplish? Margaret is still ruined. The world knows she falsified evidence. She's finished whether I had my hand in it or not. Long silence, then Margaret stood up. She was trembling, but when she spoke, her voice was clear. You're right. The room shifted. Johnstone's expression flickered with triumph, and until she continued, I let myself be led. I let my father's mistakes make me blind. And I let you, she breathed, use me. Jay's hail sharply. I don't know if I can fix it. Don't know if my career will survive this. But I do know one thing. At least I have the truth. Johnstone scoffed. Truth? Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, observing him. Yes, Reverend, she said, softly. Truth. You see, you thought you were in control. You thought you were writing the ending. But I'm afraid, dear, the ending was never yours to write. Crack stepped forward, then, handcuffs gleaming. Edward Johnstone, he said, voice steady, you're under arrest for blackmail, falsification of evidence, and conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. For the first time Johnstone's face changed, not rage, not smugness, just ESS. The truth had caught up with him, and he had nothing left to say. The handcuffs snapped into place. Miss Marple watched as he was led out, disappearing into the rain-soaked streets of St. Mary Me. And just like that the storm was over. When the room had emptied, and the voices of the gathered witnesses had faded into the night, Margaret remained standing. Miss Marple poured a fresh cup of tea, then slid it across the table toward her. Margaret stared at it, then let out a small hollow laugh. Is this where you tell me I did the right thing? Miss Marple stirred her own tea, watching the steam rise. No, dear, this is where I tell you that sometimes doing the right thing doesn't feel very good at all. Margaret's throat bobbed slightly, but she nodded. Miss Marple's voice softened. But the difference between you and Johnstone is that you can live with the truth. Margaret let out a breath. She reached for the tea, her hands steadying around the cup, and for the first time in weeks, perhaps longer, Margaret Spencer looked like a woman who might just find her way back. Miss Marple watched her a moment longer, then took a sip of her own tea. Outside, the streets of St. Mary Me were quiet once more, and inside, for the first time in a long time, so was Margaret Spencer. The morning after the storm, St. Mary Me looked the same as it always had. The streets were swept clean, The shopkeepers lifted their awnings and the church bells rang out as if nothing had ever happened. But Miss Marple knew better. Beneath the fresh scent of damp earth and cold smoke, there was something else lingering in the village air. The ghost of a scandal, the whisper of a crime meticulously crafted and painstakingly unraveled. She had seen it before, and she would see it again. The village returns to normal. Almost at the Rose and Crown, the patrons spoke in hushed voices over their morning tea. They say he confessed. Mrs. Aldridge muttered over the rim of her cup that Johnston went right mad at the end, started ranting about justice and how Margaret got what she deserved. Mabel Dunn stirred her tea with unnecessary force. A man of the cloth, indeed. But I tell you this, Thomas Beale added from the counter, his voice dry as old parchment. Johnstone wasn't the only one with dirt on his hands. The room stilled. Miss Marple, seated near the fire, did not react. She simply continued, sipping her tea. Beale shook his head, tossing a glance toward the newspaper, folded beside him. Margaret Spencer's name was all over it. PR sequence, protection, implication in evidence, tampering. Leonardo, repeated, told her filming up, and dropped his name, as he told her filming up. She won't see prison, Mrs. Aldrich said, sniffing, but she'll never work again, will she? She'll never be trusted again, Beale corrected. And what's a prosecutor without trust? Mabel's spoon scraped against her saucer. Poor girl, I suppose it's a mercy she wasn't charged alongside him. Miss Marple finally looked up. Mercy, dear, is not given lightly. It is earned. A ripple of silence followed, because they all knew the truth. Margaret hadn't been innocent. She had played into Johnstone's hands, taken the bait, because she had wanted to win more than she had wanted to be right. And now she was paying for it, not with a cell, but with something far worse. A life where she would always wonder, had she ever been the woman she thought she would. Miss Marple folded her napkin neatly. Some lessons she knew could not be taught. They had to be learned in ruin. Matthew Carville sat in the bookshop. He once thought he'd never return to. The faint scent of ink and paper filled the air, familiar and grounding, but the world had shifted beneath him for 6 months. He had been a prisoner, a villain in the public eye. Now he was something else in time. A man nearly broken, but not quite. Miss Marple sat across from him, watching as he ran his fingers along the spine of an old volume. You know, he said, voice rough with something unreadable, when they let me out, I thought, this is it. I'll walk into town, and they'll look at me like I'm a ghost, or worse, like a criminal who got away with it. She didn't speak, just let him find his words. But they didn't. He continued, shaking his head slightly. They look at me like something unfinished. Miss Mar's lips curved slightly. Because your story is unfinished, Mr. Carvo, and they don't know yet whether to fear you or forgive you. His throat bobbed. And what do you think? Miss Marple studied him for a long moment. He had been accused of murder. He had been nearly buried alive in a lie. And yet he had not been wholly innocent either. You are neither the hero nor the villain of this tale, Mr. Carl, she said, finally, that I believe you are a man who has learned the cost of silence. He exhaled, looking down at his hands. And what now? Miss Marple stood, adjusting her gloves. That, dear, is entirely up to you. She left him there, surrounded by his books. A man free, but not entirely unshackled. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her quiet little cottage. The case now resolved, the pieces laid to rest. She poured herself a cup of tea, the familiar ritual settling something inside her, and yet she did not feel triumphant. Justice had been done, but it had not been clean. She had seen men kill for greed, for jealousy, for passion, but she had also seen something darker, and women who ruined others not for gain but for the satisfaction of seeing them suffer, and those were always the most dangerous. Johnstone had been one such man. Margaret had been his perfect target, and the village good, honest St. Mary Me had stood by and watched it happen. That was the thing. Wasn't it a place like this? It was never as quiet as it seemed. It held its secrets like old books tucked onto high shelves collecting dust, waiting for the right hands to pull them down. Miss Marple stirred her tea, the silver spoon clinking lightly against porcelain. She had solved this mystery, but she knew sooner or later another would come along, because beneath every still surface, something always stood, and she would be there when it did. The rain had washed the streets clean, but not even the heaviest storm could scrub away what had settled in Mead. The scandal had left its mark, not just in the newspapers, not just in the courtroom whispers, but in the people themselves. The case was closed, the culprits unmasked, and yet no one had walked away unscathed. Inspector Crack stood near the window of the Rose and Crown, his hat pulled low over his brow, fingers absently tapping against his glass. The case was over, but it still sat uneasily in his mind. Miss Marple, seated across from him, knew the look. "Well, you don't like it," she said simply. Craig let out a slow breath. "I don't like what it says about people." He turned the glass between his fingers, watching the way the light refracted through it. "Most cases I work, I know what drives them: money, jealousy, rage, simple things." He exhaled, shaking his head. "But this, the scale of it, the patience, that's what unsettles me. The way." Johnstone sat back and watched it all play out like some grand experiment. Miss Marple stirred her tea, watching the steam curl into the air. "There is nothing so dangerous, dear, as a man who believes his cruelty is justified." Crack let out a humorous chuckle. "That's the part that gets me. He didn't just want to ruin Margaret, he wanted to see her break." Miss Marple met his gaze, her voice quiet, and he very nearly did a pause. Craig leaned back with a sigh. "You know," he said after a moment, "you drive me mad sometimes, but I don't say this enough." He glanced at her lips, quirking. "You're a damn sight sharper than you let on." Miss Marple smiled faintly, setting her teacup down with a soft clink. "Yes, dear, I know." Crack huffed a laugh. "I expect you want to testify on Margaret's behalf." Miss Marple nodded. Of course, whatever her failings, she was a victim too. The court must understand that. Craig shook his head almost in wonder. "You believe in people more than I do, Marple." She considered that for a moment. "No, Inspector, I simply understand them." Margaret Spencer stood at the edge of St. Mary Mead Station, her hands tucked into her gloves, her face drawn, but composed. Her suitcases were beside her, packed but not quite full. She was leaving behind more than just cloak and belongings. Miss Marple stood beside her, watching as the train's whistle cut through the heavy air. "I suppose I should thank you," Margaret said, voice quiet but steady. Miss Marple turned to her, lips twitching slightly. "It would be the polite thing to do." Margaret let out a short, tired laugh. "I don't know what happens now," she admitted. "The hearings, the papers, it won't just go away." "No," Miss Marple said simply. "It won't." Margaret exhaled, watching the steam billow from the train. "I spent my whole life building something," she murmured, "and now it's gone." Miss Marple studied her carefully. "Then you must decide what to build next." Margaret turned to her, something wary in her gaze. "And do you think that's possible?" Miss Mark's voice was gentle but firm. "I think it will be difficult, but I do not believe you are beyond redemption, Margaret. The world has a way of offering second chances to those willing to take them." Margaret swallowed, looking away. "You'll testify?" Miss Marple nodded. "I will say exactly what happened. I will say that you were manipulated, that you were pressured, but you must take responsibility for what was yours to bear." Margaret nodded slowly. "That's fair." The train rumbled, preparing to depart. She turned back to Miss Marple, her expression unreadable. "Don't think I'll ever come back here." Miss Marple didn't argue. Some places, some scars could not be revisited. Instead she simply said, "Then I wish you luck, dear." The train door clanged shut behind Margaret, and within moments the wheels grained into motion, carrying her away from Miss Mary Me, away from the scandal, the shame, the wreckage of all she had once been. Miss Marple watched until the train was nothing but a distant shadow against the horizon. Then she turned, adjusting her gloves. It was time to go home that evening. Miss Marple sat in her cozy little cottage, the fire crackling in the hearth, the familiar rhythm of the village settling back into place. But she knew the truth. The village was not unchanged. It never was after something like this. This people would talk. For weeks, perhaps months. They would recount the scandal over tea. Biscuits, dissecting every detail, shaking their heads at the tragedy of it all. And then eventually they would forget. The village would continue as it always had, placid on the surface. Secrets stirring beneath. Miss Marple took a sip of her tea, the taste settling warm against her throat. Crack had been unsettled by the scale of the manipulation, but she had not. Because this was what people did to each other. They lied, they schemed, they justified their sins, and they carried on. She set down her cup, smoothing the creases of her skirt. This mystery was solved. The case was closed, but there would be others. And when the next secret whispered its way through St. Mary Me, she would be ready. She always was. The village had settled. A week had passed since Edward J. Stone was led away in handcuffs, since Margaret Spencer boarded her train to an uncertain future, since the name Matthew Carell had become something people could say again without lowering their voices. Life had resumed, yet St. Mary Me did not feel quite the same. Miss Marple sat in her garden, the sun warm on her shoulders, a pot of tea steaming beside her. The roses had bloomed early that year, their soft fragrance carried by the breeze blending with the familiar scent of freshly turned earth and damp hedge. She stirred her tea absently, watching the world through narrowed eyes. It had been a close thing this time, too close. They had nearly lost their grip on truth, nearly let the lie take root and thrive, and for a time the village, the people, had been willing to let it happen. It was the same story, wasn't it? People saw what they wanted to see. They had been eager to believe in Margaret's scandal was a living thing in St. Mary Mead. It settled in the cracks of cobbled streets, whispered between the hedges, and clung to the edges of every freshly folded newspaper. It was passed from one generation to the next, reshaped, retold, never truly forgotten. Even now, years after the Carville trial, Miss Marple knew that the name still carried weight. It had made for good conversation in the grocer's shop, in the post office, even in the church pews, and no matter how time softened the edges, there would always be those who clung to the whispers, who shook their heads over tea and biscuits, their voices dropping just enough to make the scandal feel fresh again. Because what was a village without a story to tell? Seated in her quiet garden, Miss Marple lifted her cup to her lips, sipping slowly. The warmth of the tea did little to chase away the cool certainty in her mind. The past never truly disappeared. It merely settled beneath the surface, waiting. A movement across the hedge caught her eye. Mrs. Aldridge, walking with her usual measured steps, her wicker basket tucked neatly under her arm. She was a woman who had learned, like so many others, how to move forward without ever truly letting go of the past. As she passed the low stone wall, she hesitated. For a moment she seemed to debate whether to stop. Then finally, a nod, a quick wary smile. Not exactly warm, but not unkind either. Miss Marple returned the nod, her expression unreadable, watching as Mrs. Aldridge disappeared around the corner. Yes, the people of St. Mary Mead did not forget. They pretended, sometimes for the sake of peace. They learned how to carry on, how to let the past slip into the background. But it was always there, lurking beneath the niceties and the freshly baked scones. She had seen it before. The cruelty that wore a polite smile, the manipulation that hid behind good manners, the darkness that thrived in places too quiet, too peaceful to suspect it. It was why she never let her guard down. She glanced toward the neatly trimmed hedges, the wind stirring the leaves, rustling through the garden, as if whispering secrets of its own. No, she was not shaken. If anything, she was reminded, this was why she did what she did, because people were fragile, they were foolish, but sometimes they could be redeemed, and if there was one thing Miss Marple understood better than most, it was people. She took another sip of tea, settling back into her chair. The warm breeze carried away the last remnants of the storm. The village was quiet again, another case closed, another lesson learned, but she knew, sooner or later the next secret would come, and when it did, she would be ready.